So this is a rather limited opportunity for me to do things like this at the moment because, well, I've only got one book out. But it's always fun for a historian when you get to a point where you are talking about something and you can read from your own book. It is fun. And in this book, my own one, Trials, Battles and Darings, will be advertised later in the Shameless book plug, shamelessly. It starts off with this section, which I was always quite happy with. Publicly, professionally, and even posthumously, Philip Vian can never be accused of being timid or diffident. Internally, he might have felt fear, or a second of doubt, but he would never let it show, nor ever want anyone to know about it. To understand this, one has to only to read Oliver Warner's introduction to Vian's autobiography, Action This Day, in which he wrote, "When war broke out in 1939, Captain Vian, as he then was, ranked among the handful of officers of the armed forces who were trained, equipped, and of appropriate seniority and experience to make it obvious that, if the struggle were to be protracted, it would be upon them that tactical success would depend." That's this book. Vian is a special type of officer. He truly is. He's a special type of officer mostly because of the fact that he wants to win a war, but he wants to win it as efficiently as possible. And for him, calculated aggression, calculated efficiency in combat is about saving lives. Because if you end the war quickly, you lose less people. And that is something which is sometimes hard to put across. Because it can sound like unkempt aggression. It can look boundless. But the reality is, he's always controlled. The reality is, Philip Vian is non-stop calculating in his mind exactly what is the best thing to do at any singular point. He just tips the scales towards engaging the enemy more closely, towards driving the point home, towards confronting the enemy. Because as I said, he wants the war to be over as soon as possible, because he doesn't want people to die. That is Philip Vian. And today we're going to be discussing his leadership and the legacy of his leadership and lessons to be learned from his leadership across 17 ships. 17 ships. Those were his commands and his flagships during his career. And I thought that would be the appropriate thing to talk about. Because every single ship which was his command, he stamped his own style on. On vessels where he was the gunnery officer or the executive officer, it doesn't have quite the same timbre. It doesn't have quite the same Vianness in it. But whether it's as a flag captain or an admiral, whether as a captain destroyers, which, by the way, Captain D basically tends to mean that they're in charge of a flotilla. He is, without doubt, always thinking, how best can I employ this force? How best can I use this force? He also does everything full throttle, which might explain the sheer number of ships he manages to bang up in his career. We'll leave that to one side. We'll be getting into that. But let's put it this way. He doesn't really acknowledge there is half speed. Half ahead, full ahead, quarter ahead. Or anything less than absolutely caning it across the ocean is not really something which Philip Vian really acknowledges. Whatever the situation is, whatever the fastest speed he can do to actually reach the target, fuel-wise, he'll be doing it. And if he thinks he can push it by half a knot, he will. He will. Every single chance he gets. That's the other thing he could be considered. Very, very fast. But yes, Philip Vian is an interesting guy to talk about. And today's going to be an interesting video, hopefully. Now, his appointment to active is a bit of an interesting thing, because he wasn't technically a specialist destroyer officer at this point. He was more of a gunnery officer. And even more so, he'd come off a staff appointment at the Admiralty, one of the few he did in his entire career. And something which tells you this is definitely the Royal Navy of the 1920s and 30s, not the Royal Navy of today. 3 months honeymoon with his wife skiing in Switzerland. Yes, he'd managed to go away with his wife for 3 months skiing and enjoying themselves in Switzerland. The Royal Navy of the 1920s and 30s understood that its role was to, manage its officers' careers and make sure they didn't burn out. And if you've got good officers and you want them to have a bit of a stable home life, sometimes you give them time off. And sometimes you don't give them a staff appointment. You literally just go, bog off for 3 months. You're on half pay. Don't come back. We'll see you in 3 months' time. We'll have an appointment for you. But take the wife, go somewhere nice. Enjoy yourselves. And it works. Active is an interesting position for him, and he writes about her. He gives you a rather interesting assessment of it. During my commission in the Active, there came a day when word was received that Rear Admiral Andrew Cunningham had been appointed to, and was shortly to assume command of, the Mediterranean destroyer flotillas. The old hands, those who, like himself, had spent years in destroyers, prepared us for tears and blood and sweat. On the first meeting him, I began to doubt. His smile was too disarming. In the event, there was sweat enough, but few tears and no blood. There was also a certain relentlessness in pursuit of excellence, mostly at a higher level than one thought decently attainable. But fun goes on because, his command of Active had not been without some issues. Active, going astern, as was necessary alongside the depot ship in Lazarento, Creek, Malta, carried away an overhanging part of superstructure and had to return to the dockyard. In my report, there being nothing else to say, the accident was attributed to pure mishandling. I was told to be more careful in future, but the Commander-in-Chief added a paragraph in the sense that he had liked the manner of the confession. This was in character, for William Wordsworth Fisher, the great Agrippa, a veritable colossus, towered over our fortunes in the Mediterranean. An inspiring command of a tactical flair which no peacetime exercise could conceal. He was a font of magnanimity and of encouragement to inspiring young officers, nearly all of whom, even in so great a fleet, he seemed to know personally. On my being promoted captain in 1934, Admiral Fisher asked me to dine, sitting beside him, and he wished me good luck with the port, and added, "You'll be in my chair one day." For once he was wrong. HMS Active was an interesting command for him to get. When you consider his command experience, this is him getting his first sole command, his first sole responsibility. And he gets quite a new destroyer for it. It really does. Having been launched in 1928, she's one of the first batch of new build ships for the Royal Navy. I'd also say, and this is just a small bit of history for you to all think about, HMS Active, as in the Type 21 frigate, was launched in 1972. We were at war in 1982. HMS Active, this one, the H-14, was launched in 1928. We went to war in 1939. HMS Active, the Active class scout cruiser, was launched in 1911. We went to war in 1914. Even if you go back further, it gets more problematic. But don't worry, there's HMS Active, the Type 31 frigate, currently under construction. Usually it's roughly a decade. Just a heads up for those who are a bit of history nerds and think about history rhyming, not repeating. Yeah, now we need the Germans to start investing in an 88mm. But leaving that to one side, HMS Active gave him a lot of experience. She's a divisional leader. She's not a flotilla leader, she's a divisional leader, which means he's responsible, theoretically, for another 4 ships. Or rather, he's got his own, and he has about 3-4 others, depending on how they're breaking up the lead, because there's usually 9 destroyers, or rather 8 destroyers and a flotilla leader in a flotilla at this point. So it gives him a lot of experience coordinating other ships. It's a good experience for him. And he's known to be very forthright. He motivates his team very well. There's lots of reports about him doing excellent work with his crew, working alongside them, learning alongside them. He's very much an active doing officer. And he does well with Active. It's appropriate for Active. And then he gets HMS Douglas. Now this is a reserve flotilla activated during the Abyssinia crisis. And quite literally, this is his first flotilla command. He's given Douglas. He's a Captain D. He's Captain Destroyers. And he gets the 19th Destroyer Flotilla. The 19th Destroyer Flotilla. Which is not a massively prestigious unit, but not a bad unit either. It's a capable force. And him, along with the first Destroyer Flotilla, his flotilla and Destroyer Flotilla, are brought from reserve and put at Malta. And at Malta, whereas the rest of the Mediterranean fleet has now gone to Alexandria, these two Destroyer Flotillas are charged with the security of Malta. It kind of shows you exactly the plan the Royal Navy would execute in World War II, where the fleet would move away from Malta, but they would retain some forces there to react and deal with threats to Malta, but also to cause trouble for any cross-Mediterranean movements. And that's what he does. He earns laurels, he earns rewards, he earns lauding during his time there. And this means he avoids a couple of years on half pay, he avoids all sorts of interesting things which could have afflicted him and could have made his career incredibly boring. He again avoids paperwork. But he gets practical experience. If you think about this, he is March 1933 to January 1935. So, in simple terms, that's 22 months of command experience on a destroyer. And then, well, thanks to Mussolini, he gets a further, and very much appreciated, 9 months as a flotilla captain. And it gets better because he does so well. Instead of getting 2.5 years half pay or something like that, like he was worrying about because of the lack of the Royal Navy wanted to keep a number of captains in service, but didn't want to keep, or didn't have enough active positions for them, so they were keeping them on half pay and letting them go off and do other things, like skiing with a wife. He goes to Keppel and takes over as Captain D of the 1st Destroyer Flotilla. And he does that from May 1936 to October 1936. Still doing a similar role, but now he's got Keppel. And this shows the experience they're putting into him. Yes, he's had experience beforehand, but they are giving him a chance to show off his leadership, and leadership as an independent command. Let's be honest, if you're the only 2 destroyer flotillas sitting in Malta, there might be senior officers above you, but the moment you're out at sea, there's no one around to tell you what to do. You're it. It's on you. He gets 2 flotillas. He gets a year of experience in 1935-36, which is a critical time period. There's all sorts of systems coming into service, there's all sorts of capabilities coming into service, and there's all sorts of things being practiced. And this is after having spent a long time going through the school of hard knocks that is the Mediterranean School, the Mediterranean Destroyer Flotillas, under Admiral Cunningham, who had them going out training every single day. Wordsworth Fisher had also had them going out every single day he could. This is the Royal Navy training people to a peak of capability. And Vian is a prime product of this. He's had exceptional experience in command. Exceptional time to learn his duties, learn his roles. And, yeah, the fact is, though, the Navy's the senior officers have picked him because of his character. You have to remember, whilst the regular flotillas are being managed, destroyer flotillas are being managed to provide you with that wider pool, when you're activating reserve flotillas for a crisis, do you go by, well, it's this person's turn, or this person needs some more sea time, or do you go, who's the one we trust the most? Who's the best candidates available? And go with the best candidates available. And Philip Vian is one of the best. And he gets a destroyer flotilla after a destroyer flotilla. This is important. To think about when we talk about him getting command of the tribal destroyers, when we talk about him doing other duties in World War II, because he has experience of independent command, and this has been fostered in him. And he's been picked by a lot of senior officers. A lot of senior officers. They might not always get on with him personally, but they've all picked him as being a good officer and someone who they can lead and command naval personnel. He is going to try for the same exceptionalism as Cunningham, always going to be striving for the best. But he's also going to think through his actions quickly, correctly, and implement. And he's not going to spend too much time second guessing when he's made a mistake. He's going to own up to it, learn from it, and move on. He's done this. He crashed active. The fact that he did own up to it, he didn't try to demur, he said, no, on me, my ship, my responsibility. I'll take whatever punishment you're going to give me. That teaches the admirals far more than someone who goes, well, you know, it could have been this thing and this thing. And did they drum him out the service? No. They want tough, aggressive officers who are going to take calculated risks. And the trouble with calculated risk is sometimes you do the calculation and it doesn't pay off. Sometimes things go wrong. And if you teach your officers that every time things go wrong you're going to slam them, then they don't start taking risks. And then you're in trouble. Because you're going to lose wars because they won't take risks. They'll never risk anything, so they'll never gain anything. With Philip Vian and his generation, the Royal Navy, and like other navies in the world dealing with their destroyer officers at this point, takes the pragmatic view that it's better to have calculated risk takers than foolhardy buffoons or scaredy cats. Neither works for you. And this then gets him into something even more fun, because he's supposed to go off to a training school. And instead, he gets a very different experience. In fact, on his appointment, he writes, sadly, joining the Royal Navy College, Greenwich, for a war course, I most unexpectedly received an invitation from Rear Admiral Lionel Wells to serve as his flag captain in Arethusa, the flagship of the 3rd Cruiser Squadron Mediterranean, to which command he had been appointed. I went and shall ever be grateful to him, not only for the chance he took in having so inexperienced a captain, but for what I learnt from him on the bridge in those 2 years. For him, the boldest course was ever the best. Brevity was the soul of wit, and the devil take the hindmost. It's a good few years, but it continues. Again, you start to realise his constant experience of working in the Mediterranean fleet. He's been pretty much with almost out any breaks, a few short months here and there, been in the Mediterranean fleet commanding ships for most of the 30s. All those pre-war exercises, and he's been part of them all. All the preparations for war, all the preparations for everything going on, he's been part of, and he's been involved in discussions. All the testing, all the training, all the development of the ships, all the planning. Every one of those naval exercises where the Royal Navy basically takes the home fleet, or the Atlantic fleet, depending on its name at the time, to the Mediterranean, has the Mediterranean go one corner, the home/Atlantic fleet the other corner, and goes ding ding ding, here's a barely written scenario, kill each other. Let's see how you win this war. He's been part of all of that. He is one of a small number of officers who have been almost solely preparing, training for all-out war for the last decade when we get to this point. And he was selected for that. He gave them an edge. That was his role, that was his purpose. And Arethusa is a great position again for him to do it on, because he's on a small light cruiser, which is basically, in many ways, a 6-inch armed destroyer. In many ways, the Arethusa class are destroyers writ large, with 6-inch guns. They really are, especially when you consider how they're handled, and this goes especially for their successors built on the same hull, the Didos. They're destroyer-built cruisers. The Tribals are cruiser-built destroyers. These are destroyer-built cruisers. They are crammed with guns and weapons on every inch of space they can get them. They are built round their weaponry. Everything is about delivering speed. Everything is about delivering those weaponry on, and this is going to sound strange, the minimum space required to deliver that weaponry. There's an interesting discursive point about the Arethusa's. That if, because of worries of the treaties, etc., the Royal Navy had kept on building them, had kept on building Arethusa's, maybe upgraded them to 3 triple turrets, like Ariel Argentina, the Argentinian ship built that's based on their design, they could have kept churning them out at quite a rate. Instead, they decided to add on 5.25-inch guns and turn the hull over to a Dido. But still, these were the lightest of light cruisers. They were the minimal entry point for the cruisers, and they were there to provide mass to the Royal Navy's cruiser force. Because it was a lesson from World War I. The Royal Navy knew what their advantage was going into Jutland. Having the big battle fleet was great. Having the most capital ships, excellent. Having a serious advantage in cruiser numbers that could support their destroyers and that could also be used themselves to do cruiser duties against their opponent, that was potentially war-winning. There is an often debated point, and this is something which comes out of the First World War and discussions over Jutland, and it's something which, when you read works like this, is coming through in all the reconnaissance formations, all the positions they're talking about, that realistically the Grand Fleet needed to do its own reconnaissance. It couldn't afford to rely on the battlecruiser fleet. And Jellicoe needed to have flung out cruisers a lot further. A lot further. The thing is, he couldn't. He didn't have enough. He didn't have enough to do all the jobs he required and do that. Interesting enough, if he'd had more Town class, or if he'd had destroyers built like the Tribal class destroyers of the generation which Vian's about to jump into, he probably would have been able to do it, because he'd have had the extra ships that he could risk in such a reconnaissance position that would actually be able to defend themselves long enough. They would be able to give accurate information, that they would be able to perform recognizance, not reconnaissance. And you might not know what the difference is because the phrasing has been lost. Recognizance, rather than reconnaissance, is a phrase the Royal Navy used in the 20s and 30s. And it means we recognise. The Royal Navy actually, at some point, in some naval officers' papers, I have to admit, it's interesting, the whole debate as to whether it gets into the official records and documents or not. Reconnaissance was, we reckon this is what the enemy have. We believe, basically, based on information. Recognizance was, we recognise what the enemy have, i.e. we know what they have, which is better to try and plan off. Believing what the enemy have, or knowing what the enemy have. That's why the Royal Navy preferred recognizance over reconnaissance. They'll settle for one, but they prefer the other. They really do. And vessels like this, that's what they were for. That's what they were for. And so, in a way, what he's serving in this role is actually the better preparation for what the Tribal class destroyers will have him do, and he'll be doing with them, than it was serving in the previous destroyer flotillas. Because the previous destroyer flotillas are about fleet work. They're about operating as part of the force. They're about using their torpedoes and using their weapons to carry out attacks on the enemy. ASW warfare, air defensive task groups, all these sort of things. That's what they're about. It's with vessels like the Arethusa class, like the Tribal class, that you get into the reconnaissance elements of the surface force, because they're relying on aircraft for it, but they know they can't always rely on aircraft for it. And aircraft are very good at reconnaissance, but for them to get close enough to do reconnaissance is often quite difficult. So yeah, This is his introduction and his training. But he still doesn't get to the tribals just yet. He has to go to the Liverpool Destroyer Flotilla, and that's what he's in charge of August 1939 to September 1939. In the preparation for war, he is now moved from being charged with defending Malta to defending Liverpool. Yeah, on the Mackay. And again, this is an important posting. This is truly an important posting, because Liverpool is considered something which the enemy might try and preemptively attack. People might try and sneak in. People might try and damage. You can't afford to drop the ball in defending Liverpool. And you're not going to put anyone but a capable officer there. You really aren't. The vessels he has might not be the very latest and best in the fleet, but they're capable. They are capable. And their capability is what gives them the strength to be able to do their job. He does that for a couple of months, and then he gets his first wartime appointments. But soon he gets to go to HMS Afridi in the 4th Destroyer Flotilla. He gets command of her in January 1940. And this is where he really starts to set the tone, following on from some excellent other officers who've been the initial flotilla commanders. He really starts to set the tone for what's going to be expected of tribal-class destroyers. I turn up for the books, and this is really quite important to remember. I put here as January 1940 Afridi, and then there's a gap to March 1940. Because what happens is he turns up, he gets his new ship, which is the flotilla leader, and this ship is the designated flotilla leader, is going into dry dock. It needs to be refitted. It needs to have a retrofit maintenance period, which, because it's already been used pretty darn hard since war began, and so it needs to go in for a couple of months of work. And so yeah, he's on Afridi, but he basically turns around and looks at his commanders of his various ships in his flotilla and goes, okay, which crew have managed to work themselves to the bone? Can't be the Afridi ones, because it's only the senior officers I'm going to move across. It's only the senior team. So which senior team can I easily replace, or should I need to replace and give them some rest? And he goes, Cossack, Sherbrooke, man, you are in the running to try and kill yourself. We know you're going to win a VC later in the war. He does. I've already done a video about Robertson Vincent Sherbrooke. In the Mad Destroyer Captains, that was a whole section about him, and he deserves it. But basically, what happens is Vian looks at his team, and one of the things Vian is always pretty good at is he expects very high standards from his team, but he rewards high standards and he takes care of his team. So, okay, so I expect you to do the best, but I'm going to do my best to give you the best the conditions which are necessary for you to do your best, and I'm going to look after you. And Vian also operates on something which I deeply respect, because it's the rule I always operate whenever I'm in charge of teams. I can tell you off. You are my responsibility. I can tell you if you've done something wrong. I can tell you if you're doing a bad job. No one else can. Anyone else above me wants to be rude about you, wants to discipline you. No, they discipline me because you're my responsibility, and I'll discipline you. They don't get to go and shout at you. They don't get to go tell you off. You're mine. You're my responsibility. And Vian is very much like that. No, you don't discipline his people. He will discipline his people. But as far as you're concerned, if anything goes wrong in his flotilla, on his ship, in his command, it's him. It's him. And I respect that a lot. That's a style of leadership I have a deep accord with. And this really starts to come through in this flotilla, because when he's dealing with scenarios which involve HMS Gurkha, which comes in later, etc., and things like that, he immediately takes the blame himself. But this event is important because this is why, when it comes to the Altmark incident, which is very famous, where Vian is specifically chosen for basically for the job, because if you look at the units which are normally running the coal ship patrol and the iron ore patrol along the Norwegian border, along their sort of the end of their exclusive their territorial waters, they're normally not the same patrol which goes out. Not the same patrol which goes out at the time of the Outmark incident. We're talking about a force which not just has a cruiser with it, but has multiple destroyers. They're all tribals, which are the elite gun destroyers of the Royal Navy, and they all have boarding crews which come from another cruiser which has had issues due to illness. So it can't be used at sea. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to take the crew from that ship, which is deactivated because it's sick, remember? So we're going to spread all the crew around all these other ships. Do you see why I find a small problem with this thinking? I'm sure there was a legitimate case that there was some illness. But if there's enough illness around the ship, it's widespread enough that they can't use it, then how is there enough healthy crew that you are prepared to spread them out as boarding teams around multiple other ships? And B, are you not worried about the infection of that's infected that ship being carried by those apparently healthy crew to other ships and then incapacitating other vessels? This is the point as a historian when you're looking back in certain events in history, when you start to go, okay, that all sounds beautifully logical until you actually say it out loud. The moment you say it out loud, it sounds intriguing as a line of logic and reasoning, and one you would not expect such a professional organisation as the Royal Navy to do, especially when it has so many medics and is so medically involved in its units. This seems rather interesting. Especially when you consider the boarding crews are going to ships which are pretty much elite destroyers and critical units for your fleet operations. Ships crews you rely on in the most extreme of circumstances to be the tip of your spear. Not crews you would be risking for something silly like making them all ill so you can't use them. Anyway, the really interesting thing about this is that the cruiser backing up the two I-class destroyers and the 3 Tribal-class destroyers. What's really more fun is that this force is all under the command of the captain of the destroyer flotilla. It might make sense, he's got some seniority, but also it's kind of unusual. Usually the cruiser captain is the one you expect to be the boss of these things. A similar thing is going to be repeated later when we see 10th Destroyer Flotilla working in defense of the invasion of Normandy. Basically, 10th DF, the destroyer, the captain in charge of the Destroyer Flotilla is boss, and everyone else is just there to support him and his unit. What's even more fun is when you realise the cruiser backing him up is Arethusa, which of course was Vian's old ship. Having the 2 I-class there, well, they have the heaviest torpedo armament of any of the Royal Navy's destroyers at the time, and 3 tribals means you can go in heavy and fight things and clear things out the way. Now, this kind of force sitting there, what's it there for? Well, theoretically, it's there to hunt coal ships and ore ships, which might be going down to Germany, down the Norwegian coast. And then they get information, the Outmark's coming through. And eventually, after doing much hunting, it's spotted by Arethusa. 2 I-class go in to try and get it, but they get held off by the Norwegians, basically. Because whilst the British have very strong suspicions, and goodness gracious me, the Norwegians have strong suspicions, the Norwegian government is being the Norwegian government of World War II. They are so scared of upsetting either side that they managed to make both sides end up planning for war against them, and the Germans actually invade them. They managed to. It is the true example of history, if ever it needed to be, that humans, through their desire to not upset anyone, can end up pissing off everyone. The Norwegian government is excellent at that in that period. They really are. They're so scared of upsetting anyone, they actually make everyone upset with them. It's almost a case of you have to pick a side because of the position you're in and pick a good side, and they don't want to. They want to make everyone not hurt them. Please don't hurt them. And it gets interesting from that point because, well, this is the point at which Cossack then comes in, and Vian takes personal command. And he had a message directly from Churchill, and that's always fun. Unless a Norwegian torpedo boat undertakes to convoy Altmark to Bergen with a joint Anglo-Norwegian guard on board and a joint escort, you should board Altmark, liberate the prisoners, and take possession of the ship, pending further instructions. If Norwegian torpedo boat interferes, you should warn her to stand off. If she fires upon you, you should not reply unless attack is serious, in which case you should defend yourself using no more force than is necessary, and cease fire when she desists. Suggest the Norwegian destroyer that honour is served by submitting to superior force. Luckily, they had a officer aboard called Craven, who was Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, and who spoke German and Swedish, and was able to communicate with the Norwegians. Now, the interesting point is that Vian works this stuff through. He works it through in a way which allows everyone to have some honour in terms of the Norwegian side. Because he basically explains that he is going to go and inspect the ship. And one of the things he doesn't do, he pointedly doesn't do, is, and this is important, he didn't take possession of the ship pending further instructions. He boards the ship, he liberates the prisoners, but he leaves the ship behind. He goes in, he pushes past Norwegians. He goes into what is in effect Norwegian, not territorial waters, but internal waters. Technically, he is the first invasion of Norway that takes place in World War II. Because technically, he penetrates inland in Jossingford. Now, there is an argument about the Altmark being in there, but the Altmark was in there as it's a prisoner ship, and it's under escort, and it's basically a merchant ship which has got some small weapons on it. It is a warship, but it's not technically carrying out an invasion. It's not coming in under arms, ready to fight. The Altmark does try and fight back. It actually, famously, they try and squash the Cossack against the side. And there is all sorts of interesting things about this event. There really are. Now, not only did this involve the last time where Royal Navy sailors would swing by rope between ships in a boarding action reminiscent of Captain Jack Sparrow and the Pirates of the Caribbean. Interesting answer if you ever ask when was the last time the Royal Navy did such an offensive boarding. No one ever seems to think 1940. Don't know why. It just doesn't really come off. Although I did once hear in a very interesting pub quiz, of which I was the quizmaster, that it was the Cod Wars. Unfortunately, for such an impraising answer, sadly not the case. But it was interesting that they thought it was that recent. But what's even more fun after all this is, one, if you read through the account, Vian is very careful not to state where he was. Whilst he wasn't in the initial boarding party of either the Cossack personnel who went across or the reservist personnel who went across, there is an interesting discussion about when he was exactly aboard Altmark, because many seem to agree he managed to make it onto Altmark himself and was packing a couple of pistols. Now, there seems to be no need to have become quite so heavily armed when the ship had been taken. But maybe he still brought them with him. That is a possibility. It's an interesting report when you consider it. Again, the reports about that evening and the actual events are, as I have often explained when I've looked at my own book and when I talk about these things, it's very complicated. There are times when I look at accounts and they are so startlingly similar in vocabulary and so startlingly careful in phraseology that I am almost certain they were rehearsed. And the thing is, they're happy to admit that they had fights with the Germans fled, they fired machine guns at them to keep them away, and all these things. So all the stuff which you would think they'd be worrying about, that comes out perfectly naturally. There's differences, there's all these things. But the stuff about certain senior officers and where they are in the engagement and what they're doing is where suddenly the vocabulary becomes very similar, the phraseology becomes very, very similar, and very, very solid. So I can't tell you exactly what those officers were doing. I can have a strong suspicion from that, but I can't put it in a book and I can't reference it, because I can't prove it. I can just say that my historian version of a spidey sense was tingling away like anything when I was reading those accounts. The other fun thing is that, consider the earlier commands that come through, they'd already boarded the ship, taken the prisoners off, were leaving and were having food and had cast off, and it's then that in following on instructions come through, apparently. It's there only when he's eating dinner that he receives a following order. If offer of joint escort and guard to Bergen is not accepted, and you have been forced aboard, action is as follows. If prisoners are found to be on board, ship is to be brought in as prize. If no prisoners are found on ship is definitely altmark, officers are to be brought to England, in order that we may ascertain what is being done with the prisoners. Ships to be left in fjord. He'd left the ship behind. And then, later on, another command came in. This was 2:30 in the morning, apparently. It reached him. Sail as soon as you recover prisoners. Leave the ship. Steer to northwest at maximum speed. Now, the interesting thing is, the Admiralty seems to have done a masterful job in delaying some of these signals actually being transmitted, but there also seems to be a slight disagreement potentially, as to when they were dispatched and when they were officially received by Cossack. What can I say? Vian is a very, very good commander, and this is the point I make about him. Boundless aggression is the perception of him. Pirate is what he's termed by Hitler himself. He's often put up there with Alexander Cochrane and those people, those sort of naval officers. He isn't. It is calculated aggression. It is calculated the whole way through about the maximum damage he can inflict on the enemy for the minimum effort. And what will be of maximum benefit to Britain in ending the war as quickly as they can. And that's the point. If he takes the ship, that causes an issue. Taking the ship would embarrass the governments, the Norwegian government. Taking the prisoners embarrasses Germany. But Norwegians go, well, you can have your ship back and there's your crew. They've all been treated fine. You just don't have the prisoners. He's measured it. But of course he gets back at this point, and then, well, then he returns to Afridi. And Cossack, well, she gets to go off and have her fun in the Battle of Narvik, but we'll leave that to one side. I do love, in here, there are some excellent pictures in this book of Cossack, and this is a painting. I actually have this painting, I printed this painting somewhere in this house. It's moved to us, we haven't found it in the box it's in yet. And I love it. It's an absolutely beautiful, beautiful painting, and it's going to be hung up in here in my office as soon as I find it. It'll be up on the wall because it's beautiful. But yeah, Luckily, Churchill was not too disappointed with him. The bringing home all the prisoners, the other laurels, they soon overwhelmed things, and so he's back on Afridi for a couple of months. And that's a fun bit of history as well. Now, in this particular scenario, there are two scenarios which I like to use as examples of leadership. One destroyed the flotilla, Gurkha, was commanded by a noted gunnery officer, Commander Sir Anthony Buzzard. I kid you not. They put a buzzard in charge of Gurkha. After years of training, presented at last with live targets, he was excessively annoyed by his inability to hit them, and turned his ship away from wind and sea to better the conditions for the control and fire of the guns. This involved leaving the cruiser screen. And I should have recalled him at once, but in those early days of their attack on ships, the tactics to be pursued by surface forces were still being worked out, and there was no set policy. Buzzard's manoeuvre cost him his ship, and very nearly the lives of his crew. Since he was now steering 25 knots in one direction, whilst the cruiser squadron screen was steaming at high speed in the other, he was quickly over the horizon, and so became a detached ship. As such, he attracted immediate attention from Luftwaffe, who naturally preferred such a target rather than a compact force with many guns. Gurkha was overwhelmed by the weight of assault, hit, stopped, and left in a sinking condition. As night drew on and the moment came nearer when the ship must inevitably go to the bomb, Buzzard's predicament became very serious. The situation was saved, and only just in time, by his firing high explosive shell into the sky. One of the bursts was observed by the cruiser HMS Aurora. Captain Louis Hamilton, who closed from a distance to investigate, found Gurkha and took off her crew. Interestingly enough, this is not the only ship which is lost to air attack in these operations. It's not the only one. And the fact is, Afridi especially is involved heavily in supporting the operations of General Carton de Watt in Norway and other operations going on around there. The Royal Navy are doing a lot of support for the army because they're not manoeuvring artillery as much in there, not getting as much artillery support, so the Royal Navy are trying to do it with destroyers, which can get inshore and up fjords, and they can outmatch most artillery pieces anyway, so it works mostly in the army's favour when they're available. What's really interesting is at this time, Vian is working a lot with Mountbatten, Lord Louis Mountbatten, who at this point was the flotilla captain of destroyers, and was doing an excellent job. It's one of the things on this channel, people often hear me being quite critical of Mountbatten in his role later on in the war and how his senior positions he gets early on. The trouble is he's very good as a destroyer flotilla captain. He's then rapidly promoted away from these things because people are worried about his connection with the royal family, and that if he gets killed, because he's doing so many high-risk things in these destroyers, that there's going to be trouble. And the thing is, he gets promoted almost as a way to keep him away from trouble. So he gets promoted without having the experience or the necessary understanding to really do the roles he's being put in charge of, or the preparation for those roles. Because the important thing for those people is that he be kept away from risk, not that he necessarily be accurately and well employed for what the jobs he was equipped for. Now, the loss of Afridi, well, that's a particularly heart-wrenching bit, and it's always interesting to read it in the words of the man who was in charge and felt most guilty for it. On reaching Admiral Cunningham's force at 2 p.m, we expected to be able to relax, since good offing had been made, and the convoy would, we hoped, be outside range of dive bombers. This was not so. A formation of Stukas arrived simultaneously with us. One of them went into a dive on our starboard side, its target obviously Afridi. The vital action was taken, a violent turn towards to make the angle of descent too steep for the pilot. I've talked about this before, how destroyers would often manoeuvre to try and avoid an attack. So you can't manoeuvre when the bomb's coming down, but you can see when the pilot starts to turn, the angle they're going to come at, and you can try and make it more difficult. At this point, Gammon reported a second Stuka coming at us from the port side. Maurice suggested reversing the rudder, but I thought this would bring the ship up steady just about the time the bombs arrived, and I asked him to continue to turn to starboard, because the hope was to make the bombs skip past. If he was steady, they might arrive dead on, but if they skip past or they deflect off the outside of the hull, that's a good thing. This was fatal. The first bomb hit us just behind the bridge, exploded in the foremost boiler room, and started a devastating fire at the after end of the mess decks. The second hit us just ahead of the bridge, and blew out a large section of the port side. Through this aperture, until the gradual flooding of the ship carried it below the water line, some men escaped from the mess decks with the help of Petty Officer L.T. Bell, who went down over the forecastle side to pull them out. Lieutenant W.G. Wheeler, Chief Electrical Officer A.P. White, and Engine Room Officer W.A. Scott worked indefatigably in the smoke and darkness to save others who had been overcome by the fires. It was soon clear the ship was sinking, and the Imperial was called alongside to take off survivors. At 2:45, Afridi's stern reared up, and the ship slid under the water by the bows. We lost 49 officers and men, 13 soldiers, and more than 30 of the twice unlucky bisons. Personnel who they picked up from an earlier loss. Do you know what I like about that passage? And do you know what I think stands up for me as Vian as a leader? Is I can see what Wordsworth Fisher and those senior admirals thought of him earlier in his career when he gave an honest recounting of events. There is no equivocation. There is no, this person advised this and I was considering. No, it's literally, this was my train of thought and I got it wrong. I lost my ship. And these are the people whose lives forever rest on me. As I've said, and as I said at the beginning of this, his account is incredible for its candour. He doesn't try and make himself out to be something he isn't. He doesn't try to polish up his good points and hide his bad points. He gives you it all. And it's a worthwhile reading. This book, Action This Day, is an excellent text for leadership, in my mind, because it's the kind of leader you want to have. Someone who's going to say, it's my fault, I did this wrong, I'm prepared to analyse it, and prepared to deal with it. And he does. And then he gets Cossack, and he has her for a good long while. But again, it's two operations I'd like to talk about with him from his experience on Cossack, because I think they give us a good idea of his leadership skill. I know I am, for these ones, quoting quite extensively from his own book, but that's because, how do I put this politely, when it comes to tribal class destroyers, I have a choice in terms of sources I can use. I can use my book. I can use an excellent book called The Tribals, published in 1957 by Martin H. Bryce. Or I can use his book. It seems to me if you want to learn about him as a leader, it helps to use his book as the basis to hear, first of all, his own words before I give you the context and the analysis. So, please note, with these particular sections, I'm being extra careful, or extra generous, depending on your perspective, because I'm going to talk about an operation which few ever hear about. It isn't one of the ones publicised during the war. In the autumn came the episode of the Aegera Light. Sir Charles Forbes had long wished to intercept the convoys which were sailed from time to time from Germany with supplies for the occupation force in Norway. Such an interception could only be off the southwest coast of Norway, where the convoys coasted in an open water before entering the leads. It had to be made at night, since a day approach would have stood no chance against enemy shore-based aircraft. Appreciating that if intelligence of such a convoy was received, the ships detailed for the attack would have to be sailed at the shortest notice, the Commander-in-Chief some weeks before had issued flotilla leaders with an operation order, which contained a minimum of the information necessary for the execution of the plan. For some reason, oh Vian, you lover of paperwork, I can't believe what you're about to admit. It sounds so unlike you. For some reason, I had not read it, or if I had missed its implications. My betting is you didn't read it. It was paperwork. You were valiantly doing your best to avoid it. It came therefore as a shock on the evening of 30th October to receive a signal ordering me to take Asante, Maori and Sikh under my orders and to sail in Cossack with them, using utmost dispatch to carry out the operation. I bet it did. On the reading of the order as we put to sea, he found it. He wasn't that disorganised. It became clear that we were to be involved in a form of warfare long unpractised in the Royal Navy, an attack without warning or prior identification on unarmed merchantmen. I love the way he says it's a long unpractised by the Royal Navy. Further, since the convoy would be guarded by escort vessels which might or might not be torpedo boats, and which when met could be under cover of shore batteries, a tactical problem arose. Whom first to attack escorts or convoys? The fighting instructions hastily produced plump for the convoy, but where our own fine ships be pinked by torpedoes hard against an enemy coast while their guns engage the merchantmen? How to attack? In close order, which would lack flexibility. When the merchant ships scattered, allow individual ships to act independently, seeking their own targets. This was certainly flexible, but as it would be the night, the enemy would lay smoke, and it might well involve an uncontrolled melee, in which consorts might fire into or torpedo one another. Finally, how to remain in action. The convoy might have 7 knots. We should scarcely to act at less than 20. Either we must reverse course frequently or circle. The latter, in the event, was ruled out by a navigator, Maurice, owing to the lack of sea room. The plan, as evolved, was imperfect, as hastily conceived plans will be. It was decided to close to point-blank range in close order, to use main armament and torpedoes against the unlucky merchantmen, and to engage the escort with pom-poms and small arms. I do love the point that he then goes on to add in as later operations of this nature were brought to perfection by Captain William Agnew in the Mediterranean. I do not know what tactics he used, but on each occasion he attacked and neither escort nor merchantman escaped. He retired as an admiral and is now a partner alongside his brother Tim, who also served with distinction in the Navy in the famous art firm in Bond Street. There's that little section of, this is what I was doing. I admit I may have not read the paperwork. And by the way, I'm not even the best at this. Someone else was better at it than me. I love this. He talks about the battle, and it was successful. They did take out the merchant vessels. But on their return, and this is the reason why you don't hear much of it, on our return to Scapa Flow, Sir Charles Forbes told me he had been able to persuade the Admiralty, who wished to claim success at a time that there were few, to refrain from publishing details of the encounter in case further opportunity of the same sort should be compromised. The incident was therefore not reported to the press. And what is not covered is the fact that it's the report from Vian after the fight which really helps the latter paragraph to become the case. 2 modifications were later introduced, which simplified night fighting. The first was flashless cordite. They were developing it, but cruisers were the priority. After this, destroyers became the priority, which abolished the blinding effect of one's own gunfire. The second was the abolition of searchlights, which provided aiming points for the enemy fire, and gave no better illumination than star shell. And that's what actually leads to the battles having a star shell gun, a 4-inch star shell gun. The next operation, of course, is the Bismarck, and there is a section there, as I've talked about it before on many videos, how 4th DF basically abandoned a convoy, goes racing into the middle of the ocean without orders, and then harass Bismarck all night. The interesting point, and I've discussed that so many times, if you want to go, please, there are multiple videos about that scenario and what happens. Again, the Mad Destroyers, I covered that in quite extensively because there's multiple officers involved in that campaign for that. But what I want to talk about is this. During these attacks and throughout the night, the enemy obtained only splinter hits from near misses by her 15-inch guns. But she shot away Cossack's wireless aerials, which was very inconvenient. A disconcerting aspect of being under fire of such big guns, which we were experiencing for the first time, was that the shells could be seen on our radar screen as they raced towards us, thus introducing some unpleasant moments until the shells plunged into the sea, exploding with a violent concussion and throwing us huge pillars of water, which seemed to tower above us. At 5 a.m. I detached Pirin to Plymouth. She lost touch, was short of fuel, and was manned largely by Polish soldiers who had suffered much from the violent movement of the ship. I felt too that her brave captain, Pulaski, would take unjustifiable risks if he regained contact in the morning. His ship was attacked by air later in the day and received considerable damage. Perhaps she had been better have stayed. It's an interesting passage all about the attacks and night he carries out, but it's the way he sums up that. He's always trying to be fair. And he's always looking after those who served underneath him. And it comes through. There are talks about when the 15-inch shells were coming in, he basically tried to make a bit of a sport of it. With the crew. He tried to encourage them to not fixate on them as, well, if any of those shells hit, the ship's over. He tried to get them to fixate on it as are we going to dodge left, are we going to dodge right, as they're being engaged. And of course that was the purpose of it. The purpose of it was to keep the 15-inch guns firing. The purpose was to keep the Bismarck fighting them all night, because you attacked them with torpedoes, and the German accounts claimed that no hits were scored, but the accounts, including in this one of the Royal Navy personnel, is that they saw explosions which fitted with their torpedoes hitting. But these things makes no difference in the ultimate outcome. What does make a difference is that it kept the Bismarck's crew up and under stress and in action stations all night. So by the next day, when King George V and Rodney hove into view, they are dealing with a Bismarck which is at the end of its rope. It has been cycled out all night. And whilst the tribals would have loved, and I'm sure Pirin would have loved, to have killed her during the night with their torpedoes and sunk her and taken the glory, or rather taken revenge, because these were the ships which had traditionally escorted Hood on occasion, and felt that her loss, personally felt her loss, was because they hadn't been with her because they'd been off doing convoy duty, and it wouldn't have happened if they'd been there. And there is a good argument for that, because they are bigger destroyers, so they're less likely to be held up so much by the stormy weather, and B, trying to order the destroyer commander not to engage is painful. Trying to order a tribal class destroyer commander not to engage a target is incredibly difficult. And if they'd been there when Hood was sunk, then they would have probably decided they had to attack Bismarck and Prince Eugen in order to protect the Prince of Wales and its withdrawal or something like that. I'm sure there would have been a justification put forward by the tribal crews about why they launched 20 torpedoes straight at the Bismarck. But yeah, it's the way it goes. These crews, they consider themselves the elite of the elite, the tip of the spear. It's their job to fight to get the other destroyers into range. It's their job to open up the gaps in the enemy's light forces to allow the Royal Navy destroyers to engage in fleet actions. It's their job to be the best example of what it is to be a destroyerman. And that's what they think of themselves, and that's the standard they hold themselves to. It's quite difficult to get over that standard sometimes. But his time in destroyers was soon to be past, and he was about to join, or rather start making use of, cruisers, because he is promoted to Rear Admiral, and this is his first flagship, HMS Nigeria. Now, he didn't just get Nigeria. He was given command of her because, well, Operation Gauntlet, going up and spending some time supporting the Russians and working with them. And he'd already been sent out there, flown out to Russia to do assessments. And if you want to read some really colourful and not good for YouTube in terms of some of the phraseology, appreciations of Kuznetsov, for which an aircraft carrier is named, and various other Russian ministers and senior personnel at this time, I again recommend Action This Day. It's a great starting point. It really is. Now, Force K, as it was, comprised of Nigeria, under Captain Duras, a friend of Vian's from his own gunnery course, Aurora, an Arethusa class cruiser, under the command of Captain Agnew, and HMS's Punjabi and Tata, two Tribal class destroyers under the commands of Commander Buss and Commander Skipwith. This was quite a coming together of all his previous ships. It was an Arethusa class cruiser, two Tribal class destroyers, and he's got a Crown Colony class cruiser as his own flagship. And basically the purpose of Force K is to show why the Royal Navy doesn't want to base surface ships from northern Russia at this point in the war. All the defences of the bases that the Russians say, there are the defences here, they're coming soon. There's a difference between defences being here and them coming soon. You have daily air attacks. Why aren't your submarines out doing anything? They aren't trained enough to do anything, and they submerge every day to stop them being attacked by the Germans from the air. Now, these are things they work on. These are things they fix. And one of the problems with the submarine crews, and please, this is an issue, is that there just hadn't been enough fuel allocated to support their training. And initially, the Royal Navy was actually quite worried it was going to be the Admiral who admitted this to them, who was going to get hurt. But the Russians actually did a bit of investigation and found out that the previous political commissar had reallocated funds for fuel storage tanks, which was necessary to be supplied and maintained to have enough fuel for the submarines to do practices, etc., had been allocated instead to building some very nice accommodations for him and the other political officers attached to the Northern Fleet at the time. So, things got interesting after that point and got dealt with very rapidly. It's a whole fraught episode with many examples of some good leadership, and also the fact he manages to hijack his friend by this point, Noel Coward, the actor, comedian, pretty funny guy, and take him with him. He manages to deal with all sorts of political intrigue and work with them, but the greatest thing is that at one point, and this is the part of the history of the event which adds to the whole operation really for me. After the Norwegian settlement had embarked in the Empress of Canada, the force set sail for England on the 3rd of September. Soon afterwards, I received a signal from the Admiralty that a German northbound convoy was expected to reach the Hammer Fjord next day. It was suggested that it should be intercepted, if conditions admitted. I replied that we would certainly try. The Hammer Fjord lies at the northern extremity of the Leads, to the westward of North Cape. The operation, which would be in narrow waters, was evidently best suited to the destroyers of the force. On the other hand, the Empress of Canada was loaded with Norwegian civilians and might encounter U-boats on her approach to the Scottish coast. It was decided, therefore, to take the cruisers into the Hammer Fjord, and I attached Empress of Canada and destroyers accordingly. The difficulty, as on earlier occasions, was to make the approach to the coast without coming under observation of enemy aircraft. This time a northerly gale was blowing, bringing low cloud and poor visibility, while since it was September, there was a few hours of darkness. The previous part of the operation had been conducted when it was the full land of the midnight sun. I can personally testify from experience of being that far up above the Arctic Circle. It's a perfect time to do aerial scouting, because the sunlight never goes away, and I took some great photos and B-roll, which we've used in videos from Narvik, at about 2 a.m. in the morning, because it was just as sunlight as 2 p.m. in the afternoon. It really was, and it was better because everyone else was away trying to sleep, and the functioning insomniac was wandering around going, "Woohoo! I have finally found a land which is suitable for me." It was a fun time. It really was. The run-in was made from 100 miles to the northward at full speed and in thickening visibility. There was a heavy following sea and uncertain light. Under the conditions, it was not possible to fix the ship's position precisely. We were still going very fast when Captain Dundas told me that by dead reckoning we had already entered the fjord. At that moment, objects were reported right ahead. These objects were ships. The cruisers opened fire at once, turning on a parallel course to the convoy which ran inshore. One enemy vessel passed down Nigeria's side too close to be fired at. A moment later there was a heavy crash forward and we imagined we had been torpedoed. In fact, we'd run down and cut in half the German training cruiser, the Bremse, which had been leading the escort. Her men became visible for a short time as they shouted in water. There were few survivors. My undertaking to M. Mezki, that's the Russian ambassador, had been kept. He'd been very worried about earlier plans for the operations, that there hadn't been plans for killing any Germans. Nigeria's forward bulkheads were stove in, and she made a lot of water. The ship was in the Hammer Fjord, with an offing to make against heavy northerly seas at best at a speed of 8 knots, whilst bulkheads were shored up. There would be light enough for enemy reconnaissance aircraft to operate in about 3 hours. Firing parting broadsides as the enemy receded from sight, the cruisers turned northward and began their slow withdrawal. Visibility remained bad during the morning, and our departure was made undetected. After we reached the United Kingdom, Nigeria was sent to Newcastle for extensive repairs. Once again, though, Vian bashes up a ship, and no one really cares, because Vian's done a very good job. He's done a very difficult job in a delicate situation. He's managed to do enough to make the Soviets happy, not leave the Royal Navy committed to providing a surface force of large ships in the land of the midnight sun during the daylight months of the summer, and, yeah, had also managed to evacuate both Russian and Norwegian people from these various islands and shut down some coal mines. All this was very, very useful. Very useful. But now we're at the Shameless book plug point, and yes, the advantage I do have of saying this is the most recent book to be published talking about tribals, battles and darings, and talking about what they got up to during the war, and how that informed the evolution of the tribal battle and daring design, which was the genesis of the modern destroyer. They were the large destroyers the Royal Navy really wanted for various fleet works. And that is probably the most direct Shameless book plug I've done in a while. And Shameless book plug is literally me plugging my book. It's me saying thank you to people for liking and supporting and sharing the channel, and for everyone who pressed the subscribe button down below, especially to people who fill in the bell so you get notified of all videos and you get to decide which ones you watch rather than the YouTube algorithm. But yeah, the thing is, that book was finished thanks to this channel, thanks to your support, your kindness. The next books that are to come are thanks to your support, your kindness. And it's been this path which has allowed me to pursue a policy of being an independent naval historian. Of being able to fund my research without having to go through research grants and all those things which come with, even well-meaning, but they still come with strings. They come with guidelines, with who gets your research first, who gets to see it first, what kind of metrics it goes for, what kind of form it takes, what kind of approach you take. And the thing is, the benefit of doing YouTube, the benefit of your kind support on Patreon, of your memberships here, of the Ko-fi donations for Iron Brew, which I go through far too much of. It's a soft drink, by the way. It's a Scottish version of Coca-Cola in some regards. But it's basically how I take in caffeine and sugar. All this is thanks to you and your kindness and generosity. All the things I accomplish are thanks to your support. And honestly, I couldn't imagine doing it a different way now. I don't know how. Someday I might have to. Someday the world might change again and I might have to do it a different way. I might have to come up with another way to do it. But I won't. I won't until I have to. And I hopefully never will do. hopefully can always keep it this way. And that's thanks to your support and your kindness. So thank you. With that being said, this is probably going to be a rather long video, considering we are at slide 11 of 22. And we are just about halfway through. And we have only just reached HMS Naiad, which, curious enough, was also the name I gave my first Subaru. So because I always either drive Volvos or Subarus, my Volvos get named for battleships, Subarus get named for cruisers. You can work out why yourself. But yes, this was him doing his job as Rear Admiral 15th Cruiser Squadron. And basically he's back in the Mediterranean. And I'm fairly certain when he returned to the Mediterranean, there were a lot of Italian naval officers who basically started having boss music sounding in their ears at this point, because there was someone coming who would literally chuck everything at them, and it was going to be combined with Cunningham on the strategic level. So Cunningham now has Vian as a tool in his arsenal. And that's not really fair. That's not really fair. That doesn't mean he always enjoys having Vian under his command. And here is a good example of why senior officers both love him and worry for him. On the 8th of December, intending to intercept supplies being run by enemy in torpedo boats from Naval to Derna, the Commander-in-Chief sailed that well-known destroyer officer, Captain Philip Mack in Jervis, with 2 ships of the 22nd Flotilla to patrol of the port. I sailed in Naiad with the destroyers Griffin and Hotspur to act in support. The patrol found nothing, but the destroyers were attacked by torpedo bombers, and Jackal, one of Mack's ships, was hit. The cruisers then moved in. They were ordered to take over the patrol the following night, and to sight Derna the next morning, in case there should be ships unloading in the port. It seemed to me that as Naiad was so much larger than any ship which could be berthed in Derna, our sighting the port to achieve the objective given could only result in being ourselves sighted, which would of course bring reaction from enemy aircraft operating from airfields in the area, and from the shore batteries. Following the line of thought, why be bombed without having a go first? Start to see where the problems come in. Orders were given to bombard during the approach, preference being given to shipping as targets. Some staff officers disagreed with the policy, saying that it was provocative and unnecessary, but it was duly carried out. Visibility, although good offshore, was poor near Derna. At 7:30 AM, at 6,500 yards, the town was sighted. That's getting awfully close in destroyer gun ranges. Those guns are quite capable of hitting targets at 25,000 yards. 6,500 yards is, we want to do some pinpoint targeting range. And a merchant vessel could be seen unloading alongside a northern breakwater. Naiad and the destroyers opened fire at once, hitting the upper works of the merchantman and buildings behind her. The shore batteries, 3 medium guns and a number of small ones, made an effective reply. At 4,000 yards, now down to 4,000 yards, this is getting far closer, the ships turned seawards and fire ceased at 750. Yes, you've just taken a cruiser, 2 destroyers into 4,000 yards off an enemy port. Your maximum range of your guns is officially listed at 24,000 yards. Maximum effective firing range is 23,400 yards. So that's why, honestly, I'm not sure I believe the 24,070 yard figure for the maximum firing range figure. The reason being, effective firing range is you can hit within a certain distance of a target, certain radius of the thing you're aiming at. You will hit within this bubble. If you're still achieving what the Royal Navy considers an effective firing range with those shells at 23,400 yards, the odds of the fact that your maximum range for your shell is 24,000 yards suggest the deviation, including the drop, is so small as to make minimal difference. And this is firing at 45 degrees. So engaging at 4,000 yards with these ships, Yes. At 8:15, the expected air attack developed, and sorties by 30 aircraft with bombs and torpedoes continued spasmodically until 12:30. Naiad suffered unimportant damage from a near miss. One aircraft was shot down, one was probably destroyed, and one damaged. The force returned to Alexandria at 2:15 on the 11th of December. The Commander-in-Chief evidently agreed with the protesting members of the staff. In forwarding my report of proceedings, he wrote, "The bombardment of Denner had not been specified in orders issued to the Rear Admiral commanding 15 Cruiser Squadron, but was carried out on his own initiative. This action probably had useful morale effects. It had the not unusual result of drawing down a series of air attacks, which fortunately caused no serious damage." Cunningham was sitting there going, "Okay, I was trying to dial down the issues in that area to lull them into false insecurity, but I sent Vian. Oh my." And this is what Vian gets up to. Now, the eventual loss of Naiad is certainly an event which also stuck with him as a leader. At 8 p.m, as the force was approaching Alexandria, a destroyer in the screen sighted a surface U-boat awaiting us in the dark. The matter was urgent, but the destroyer, instead of using a brilliant light or a wireless signal, elected to give alarm with a small dim light shaded. Probably trying to preserve secrecy so they could attack the submarine, but life happens. Time elapsed before the signal was seen, and almost as it was received, I saw a torpedo track approaching Naiad, which was too close to avoid. I say almost, but indeed there were seconds in which the helm could have been put over. As I was on the bridge, Grantham asked me which way to turn the force, just as the alarm belatedly came through. I momentarily deliberated. Fatally, the torpedo exploded in the exact spot in which a single hit could sink a cruiser of the Dido class. That is, on the bulkheads between the two engine rooms. A few yards either side, which an immediate alteration of course would have ensured, would have lodged the torpedo in one engine room only. As it was, Naiad was doomed. The water pressure set up in the engine rooms burst the bulkhead into the water boiler rooms. The ship at once heeled 20 degrees, and within minutes turned right over and sank. Just at the end, when the last of us were about to take the plunge, I noticed that Grantham was without a lifebelt. He'd been too fully occupied in seeing if the ship would be saved, and when he found that it was impossible in making arrangements for orderly abandonment, to remember his own needs. I next saw him in the water, ferrying two men, beltless non-swimmers, to a raft somewhere a distance away. He helped others afterwards, making no attempt to board a raft himself, for they were overcrowded. He was picked up at the end of his tether, completely exhausted, about half an hour later. I believe Hankey and myself were the last to go. The ship had then heeled about 60 degrees, and we decided to clamber and slide down the upper side, the lower part of which, being normally underwater, was encrusted with barnacles. Being run down, I was suffering from carbuncles, having a particularly big one on my behind. I remarked to Hankey that I was not looking forward to sliding over the barnacles. He said, "I expect the salt water will do it good," slipping into the water before I could retort. The cruelty of the man. But yes, that was the loss of Naiad. But that doesn't end his experience in the war and his experience serving on her. Or rather, with the Didos. He then gets Dido herself for a bit. And he has another job, and he has a lot of Dido-class cruisers for this duty, and it's kind of appropriate. You've got a guy who's been turned into a destroyerman, is now commanding the destroyer-built cruisers. Because he can get the best out of them, and he does get the best out of them, repeatedly getting the best out of them in various combat scenarios. So Dido takes over as his flagship for a very short amount of time, and basically goes off and does an operation without him, actually. He lets the captain have her, take her off as a private ship, and then he, pretty much his next flagship, realistically, therefore, is Cleopatra, his third Dido class. So she's his flagship in the Second Battle of Sirte. And the Second Battle of Sirte is a tremendously interesting operation. The enemy... The thing is, they're surprised because the enemy force comes from Messina, not Taranto. And basically the convoys run into each other. And again, he's left with a dilemma and a discussion. Cleopatra's Bridge was hit, as he puts it, early in the affair. An officer and 14 men were being killed. This deprived the flagship of the ability to make signals by wireless and left her with only one pair of signal halyards. The damage thus sustained was actually of no importance. The leaders of the divisions of the striking force were well aware of my intentions, and communication for the time was unnecessary. Again, distributed authority, but he takes the responsibility. And the divisions were doing very well. Very well. The real point, though, that we have to consider with him, and the point where he has to make quite a heavy decision, and quite an important one, was at the end. Owing to my having diverted them southward during the engagement, and to their slow speed, no merchantman made Malta before daylight, and disaster followed. The Talbot and Pampas arrived safely at 9:15 a.m, but the Breconshire was hit by bombs that had to be beached, while at 10:30 Clan Campbell was hit and sunk. The return passage of the Alexandria force was hampered by weather, which caused reduction of speed, so making ships more vulnerable to air attack. Our long-range bow fighters made a welcome appearance before matters became serious, and of those air attacks which were pressed home, none were successful. What is really great again about this particular period and this particular book is, in this chapter, is he gives all the credit to his divisional commanders and the officers who he's told what his expectations were. He's seen how good they are, and he's let them do it. But the blame he takes again on his shoulders. As I've said before, and I want to emphasize, he is an officer for whom the buck stops with him. The buck stops with him. However, all good things have to come to an end, including being Rear Admiral of a cruiser squadron. And after the Second Battle of Sirte, where the Italian convoy and the Royal Navy convoy had basically run into each other, he does get other operations. And his flagship for Operation Husky is HMS Glengyle. Definitely not a cruiser. And also definitely not his flagship for the Operation Husky. But it's where you will find a lot of sources will say it is. But unfortunately, it's very easy to correct, because in his own book, he tells you what his flagship is. His flagship was HMS Hilary. So why? Why is there discrepancy? And it's actually very easy to go back and check and find out the actual details of which ship is his flagship. And again, it comes down to some of the wartime obfuscations, some of the operations going on, but also I think some people just made some mistakes, and it's been repeated often enough that now it's treated as fact in some circumstances. The reason I've done it this way is because I once was in a presentation, I was giving a conference presentation, I was talking about Philip Vian, and I mentioned Hilary was his flagship, and quite a senior professor corrected me. And I luckily had this book with me, and I went, well, that's what he says, chapter 10. As had happened before, when sent to Russia, I was summoned one night to see the First Lord, a post that's still held by Sir Dudley Pound. He told me I was to succeed to command of Force V, and directed me to repair forthwith to the Clyde area to hoist my flag in HMS Hilary, the headquarters ship. And if you go and look at Hilary's history and you look at Vian's history, they, in various other sources, they mention Hilary. But for some reason, Glengyle is the one which is more generally talked about. And I'm not sure why. I really don't. As I said, there's official records, but it's so... Yeah, there's some official records, and there's some various publications seem to have picked up and carried on the error. But, and by the way, if you go check Wikipedia, that's wrong, because it's citing an incorrect publication. But literally, chapter 10, Philip Vian's own book. That paragraph there. There you go. HMS Hilary. So. And he takes command because his friend, and it was his friend, Philip Mack, a destroyer commander who, of quite some reputation, had actually been killed in an air crash. He'd been killed in an air crash. And therefore, they need someone to rapidly take command and run one of the task forces for Sicily. And who best do you pick? Philip Vian. Someone who will do whatever is necessary to do and will motivate his crews to do that and what's necessary. Now, belying his hatred of staff work, he does seem to organise a very well-run part of the landing forces for Husky. In fact, he gets complimented for doing so and for stepping in by none other than Admiral Ramsey and a fair number of the Americans, including Eisenhower, who he works with during the operation. He also, of course, runs into Mountbatten as well at this point, who he... It's interesting to note where previous conversations about Mountbatten have always been how pretty much how good he is and how wonderful and how good he is. This one is sort of he's there and he's being around, but you always get the impression from Vian that whilst he isn't willing to outright criticize his friend is really not up to his normal surety. He is flitting around. The phrase is as combined operations, with his combined operations hat on, he's pushing in. Well, if he's there to be useful, he doesn't need to push in. But still, there are times of brevity, and this is the sort of thing which again helps morale. U-boats caused no losses in the Atlantic. U-boats caused no losses in the Atlantic. On the 5th of July, the convoy passed the Rock of Gibraltar and entered the Mediterranean. Soon afterwards, a carrier pigeon was seen by one of the escorting captains to have lodged at the masthead of a ship. Seeking to acquire merit, he ordered a hand aloft to capture the bird. He then sent me a signal reporting the incident and asking instructions. The reply I gave was, cross-examine in Pidgin English, please. Cross-examine in Pidgin English, please. I'm sure that made everyone laugh. And that's the thing. It's weird to say, but at certain points in a formation's moving, the commander of the force basically becomes the morale officer. Because if they try to do anything else, they're going to be micromanaging, and that's going to cause more trouble. It's going to stifle people's ability to deal with situations when they come up, and it's going to cause them to be all looking to you the whole time and not being able to do stuff. So you don't want to start wandering around getting into other people's jobs, but you honestly don't need to do much else other than sit there, nod, and keep an eye on what's going on and basically deal with problems if they come up, but otherwise just watch what's going on. Be a presence in the room, be a reassurance. And so, yeah, morale officer. And Hilary is perfectly good for the task. She's a Camel-Laird's built... Well, I wouldn't really call her necessarily a liner. She is technically called a steam passenger liner, but she's a vessel built for the Boo Steamship Company. And she's a gorgeous vessel, but she's definitely not a fast ship. She's a 14 knots vessel. 14 knots. But she does have two 6-inch guns, a 12-pounder gun, and 4 AA machine guns, and later on numerous other things get added because, well, Vian seems to be able to bring with him, whilst he doesn't always seem to get the officers he wants with him, there are certain chiefs which seem to pod around with him, and his commands are rarely short of pom-poms and other heavy machine guns, as they considered them. Because technically that was, of course, what a pom-pom is, a heavy machine gun. And that then leads us to HMS Unicorn, which is his next big flagship. And that's for another Force V. Now again, this is a complicated situation because this isn't actually his flagship. This is his flagship, Euryalus. And why Well, occasionally some books misidentify it, but actually the thing is he goes between both ships. His technical flagship is Euryalus, and it's preferable for when dealing with the smaller carriers because it has actual facilities for staff. However, there's a problem in Force V or Task Force. I think the Americans refer to it as Task Force 88. But as Vian called it, it was Force V because that's what he was still assigned as. So it gets a whole lot of fun stuff. But basically, his big problem for this operation is that his staff is split, and he is being asked to do things like stay in support because they can't set up the airbase ashore, which is going to push the escort carriers, because that's what the bulk of his force is, they're battler, attacker, hunter, and stalker, to their limit. He has 3 light cruisers, Euryalus, Scylla, and Charybdis. And of those, let's be honest, Scylla and Charybdis are both the 2 which have been armed with 4-inch rather than 5.25s. Euryalus is the only full-fat Dido. Also has 9 destroyers. 9 good destroyers to help his force. But there are problems with it. And whilst he says overall it demonstrates that, frankly, if you're going to run an operation with these small escort carriers, you need a ship like this light cruiser. You need a ship like a Dido to have space for a staff, for an admiral to do his jobs. He has a lot of problems because a lot of the staff to do with maintenance and assessment of aircraft and his air operations are on Unicorn. And a lot of his fleet staff are on Euryalus. And this leads to issues. This does lead to issues. And so, this is also why sometimes you'll see books describe this as the flagship. Sometimes books will mention this. This is the one which is technically the flagship. But this is the one which he also has to spend a lot of time on, and pretty much is where his air groups are run from. So that's his problem. That is his problem. The other big problem for his force, and this was what required him to do the most work really in terms of ship handling, was that the maximum speed of the Woolworth carriers, the escort carriers, was only 17 knots, and they must turn into the wind for flying aircraft on and off. The problem is how, with so little speed, and whilst remaining within our very limited area, to have the ships back at leeward end in time for the next flying operation. And it's always understood, though, that this is nothing compared to the requirements and the exegesis of those involved in the actual landings themselves, the troops and amphibious forces going in, which, again, he's got experience of previously from Operation Husky. There was one advantage, though, one massive advantage for him to be in an AA cruiser, and that's this. The operation of 5 aircraft carriers together was a novelty, as only in recent months had there been enough of them to form a squadron such as that in Force V. The control from a cruiser flagship was an experiment which proved successful, since the small escort carriers had very limited space on their bridges and for operation rooms. In the Euryalus, far from the noise of flying operations, we were able to give all our attention to manoeuvring the squadron and to controlling the aircraft in the air. These included the fighters sent from Illustrious and Formidable of the covering force to give us protection while our own fighters looked after the landing area. And that's how they pretty much ran it. But there are issues. There are a lot of issues. And one of the things he really does find annoying is that every time he's got to ask technical questions, and this, by the way, doesn't mention in this book. He's very careful in this book to sometimes not point out the problems in things, but you can see where they're going around, and when you go and investigate, you find out other sources talking about it. He found it very annoying that for technical things, that all the people to explain to him were on Unicorn. And so Unicorn doesn't really have the space for a flag team, doesn't have the staff space, but he goes on it and visits it quite often. He goes around, tours around all the ships when he can. He does this by boat, and he often does this in his old captain's uniform. He still has his captain's jacket. Which does lead to an interesting description, because once I was reading an account from a pilot who basically was saying that he was complaining about the difficulties they were having to a captain who came round, who seemed to know what he was talking about, but just turned up and asked, and he was complained full-throatedly to him. And then, he presumed he must be a staff officer of Vian's that he was complaining to. It was only a few years later, when he was in the Pacific Fleet, and he met the Admiral in charge of the carriers in the Pacific, that he realised the captain he'd been complaining to so vociferously about Philip Vian and all the stuff he got up to had actually been Vian. Now, you might go, well, his picture had appeared in the papers, etc. Yes, but not everyone reads all the papers, and not everyone's all the papers got shown, and it hadn't been that often in the papers. It literally had been Cossack mainly, a little bit further back. So, yeah, I can see that happening. And that also becomes the model for the Royal Navy operating their task forces from then on. Whenever they are operating task forces of Woolworth carriers, escort carriers, in a strike carrier role or whatever, they have a cruiser with them as flagship. And they'll often have two didos, or a dido and a tribal attached, to basically act as flagship and a secondary flagship should things go wrong. And that's really quite a big difference, because the Americans always insist it's never necessary. But I do imagine if the Americans had built more of the Atlantas, they would have found themselves being pushed into that role as well. And I do wonder how that would have affected certain events in the World War II. If these groups of escort carriers, when doing these support operations, had something which was far more worked up as a staff space, as a flag space, for command and control, with them to act as their lead ship. It's also worth noting that this is the period when it comes to, and it's important to work it out, to consider it, where there are certain fractions from the fleet era on with Vian. They really find the confined operating space, they find the issues they have with their aircraft, all these things. He is the one who takes a lot of the blame. And again, it would have been very easy for him to say, well, it's not my fault you've got a confined operating space, that's what's been allotted to us, that's what's been cleared by mine clearance and all these things. And he doesn't. He takes it. He doesn't pass the buck. And again, he redeems himself in many, many ways, and what he gets up to on his next flagship, and it really is his flagship, is really interesting. But just in the case of his two Mediterranean flagships, where it's often confused recounting of exactly what he's running and commanding from, what he's actually doing the mission from. Both times, it's not been the ship that's named, often in some books, because honestly, and I could kind of figure it out, once you have the fact that there's some staff officers and some personnel running the air operations in terms of the maintenance and in terms of running some of the plannings and some of the bomb loadouts and a lot of the real detail for the aircraft before they're airborne from Unicorn, and you have him wandering around, it's very easy to start going, well, Unicorn's the biggest ship there, must be his flagship. It's not. But it is also sort of, so you're not wrong if you call it to say it's his flagship during the operation, you're just not fully right, because technically his flagship's this one, but his staff is kind of distributed and he wanders around the whole fleet as often as he can. But the next operation, he gets HMS Scylla, and that's his flagship for his part in Operation Overlord. By now, he's quite an experienced amphibious warfare operator. Let's be honest, this is his second amphibious operation to take part in as a senior commander. And he also did Namsos during Norway at the beginning of the war and various other things. He knows his way around an amphibious operation. And he's given command of the Eastern Task Force for Operation Overlord. And the only person he's probably jealous of in the entire operation is the guy in charge, Basil Jones, in charge of 10th Destroyer Flotilla, because he'd probably prefer to change place with him and be doing that job. Again, it is an operation where he is mostly there because they need someone to be there in case things go wrong. That's what a lot of the command structure and staff is in Overlord. They are coordinating things, but they're only going to be really needed if things go wrong. Are they going to again act to command? That probably explains why his summary of it is: conditions of wind and sea on the day of sailing were, in my appreciation, unexpectedly severe for the launching of an operation of this type. They imposed a high test on landing craft crews. Their spirit and seamanship alike arose to meet the greatness of the hour, for they pressed forward ashore over or through the mined beaches in high heart and resolution. There was no faltering, and many of the smaller craft were driven on until they foundered. He talks a lot about the crew, and he really, I wouldn't want to say enjoyed, but he did his best with the ships he had on his command. And he does a lot of peering into other areas. One of the things about his style, and this was pointed out, was that every evening a conference was held in Silla 2, to which came the flag officers of the bombarding squadrons, the assault force commanders, the commodore maintenance, the captain patrols, the military and air liaison officers. The report for the day, for transmission to Admiral Ramsay, was first prepared, and the plans for the following day were drawn up. These largely centred on the build-up, as the unloading of ships and craft on the beaches was termed. And that's what it works out from. He is doing his best to lead this force, and mostly it's by being the presence there, the reassuring presence that if something goes wrong, if German surface forces or other things reacted, there's a problem that needs to be instantaneously dealt with from both the people above and the people below. There is someone there who will react and manage events. He also is quite good at a fine tone of phrase. For example, his other signal from the period: by fine disregard for danger, by adherence to orders, and by a ready appreciation of the demands of the varying situations which have arisen, the Merchant Navy has once again proved the staunch and faithful ally of the Royal Navy. Yeah. Vian does well. Vian does really well. But with all this experience, it's soon time for him to get... well, he's got carrier experience and amphibious experience now, so let's send him to the British Pacific Fleet and 1st Aircraft Carrier Squadron. Remember, this is an officer who earlier in his career had been turned down for command of a carrier because they felt he doesn't really have aviation experience. And now we're going to give him fleet carriers. And he immediately... one of the interesting legacies is I had this conversation with someone not that long ago about British carrier design. And I noticed something, that from a certain point after World War II, the bridge structures and the island structures on British carriers grow bigger. And they just keep getting bigger. And now, of course, today we have a twin island structure, as well as a subterranean CIC and things, etc. And, yeah, I asked where this came from. And basically, when you track down the information, you track it back. I had a suspicion, but it was interesting when they said, well, it comes from this requirement, okay? The Royal Navy have a requirement in there which requires staff space on their capital carriers. And requires these spaces. Sit there and go, right, so this is the modern requirement. That's based on a requirement which was written in the 1970s, which is based on a requirement written in the 1950s, and that's based on a report written by the commander of the 1st Aircraft Carrier Squadron in the Pacific at the time, Philip Vian, complaining about the space for flag officers on aircraft carriers and their staffs being terrible and causing issues with the operation of the carriers, because you start having to impede on space which you need for pilots and observers and engineers. Now, it's probably this report and these problems which is why so many thinks the only flagship he commanded, sometimes from first Aircraft Squadron, if you read some sources, and I said everyone, I should say many, is HMS Formidable. But actually, he always claims that the Royal Navy gave him a bait and switch, because they deploy him on HMS Indefatigable, new implacable class carrier, large amount of space for an admiral and his staff, and plenty of room for him to move around in. He deploys there. They go, we don't want you to sail Indefatigable because she's a new ship, and frankly, we're not sure she can take dealing with staff as well as running operations. She's got enough learning to that one. We've got Formidable. We've got Indomitable, I mean. She's also an experienced ship. She's an expanded, illustrious class. She's got space. Great! That's fine. She's got extra space. She's not quite as good as Indefatigable, but we can do operations from her. We can do them. It can be done. And then when Indomitable gets damaged and has to go and be repaired and maintained and all these things in June 1945, that's when they move on to Formidable for some of the later operations. And that is when you run into trouble, because Formidable's crew and aircrew had got used to being a private ship, and suddenly they were being asked to move all around. Suddenly you have quite a large staff, because believe it or not, and I do mean, I'm going to clarify this one, he is not second in command of the British Pacific Fleet. That is Admiral Rawlings. Commander of the British Pacific Fleet is, of course, not with them. Bruce Fraser, as a full admiral, has to stay back in Sydney, has to stay in Australia, has to stay away from the area of operations, because he outranks, as a full admiral, most of the American officers there. And that would cause trouble if he arrives. So basically, they detached the second in command of Vice Admiral Rawlings to be in charge of the force. But Vice Admiral Vian is in charge of the aircraft carriers, and is, how do I put this politely? Basically, everyone else is there to escort him as far as he's concerned, and he acts like it sometimes with good need. Now, this means that whilst theoretically Rawlings is the second in command, and is in command of the forces, yes, he okays all the operations. Once it comes down to tactical coordination, though, where Vian's taking his carriers, everyone else has to follow. So, how do I put this way? It's a very interesting marriage between Rawlings and Vian, of the sort of, I'm in charge, yes, but I am supposed to be in charge of that. So let's call this an equal relationship, and pretend I'm not going to be completely following you around wherever you go. It's one of those scenarios. But yes, so he comes out with staff, which comes out with him, broadly speaking, on Indefatigable, which has a lot of space. Then moves to Indomitable, which has enough space, and then eventually gets put into Formidable, where there isn't enough space, and that's what causes quite a lot of the interesting memories from the British Pacific Fleet and 1st Aircraft Carrier Squadron. We also, I have to say, when you read his personal accounts, you start to learn what really is motivating him with his policy towards airmen. He will always do whatever he thinks he can, even reluctantly sometimes, but never as far as anyone else knows, to try and save them, because of this. 32 of our airmen were missing at the end of the day, but the fatal majority remained unknown to us. It was always a grim thought that even if they had not been killed in action, savage treatment at the hands of the enemy was likely to await them. This was confirmed later when it was learnt that 9 of our men who had been taken prisoner were murdered some months afterwards. The murderers, 3 junior Japanese officers, admitted to the crime and committed suicide before they could be brought to justice. The knowledge that prisoners might be threatened with execution or torture to extract information not only made casualties particularly hard to bear, but led to our aircrews being kept ignorant of details of all operations other than the particular sortie in which they are engaged. This could not but affect morale to some extent. At the same time, we naturally took all possible action to rescue any airmen known to be down in the areas where we could possibly reach them. For this service, we had, besides our destroyers, 2 Walrus amphibious aircraft in Victorious. The airmen always knew that we would strain every nerve and take risks to rescue them. And he would. Sometimes reluctantly, Sometimes not reluctantly. Sometimes he would go, I'm not sure if this is worthwhile taking my entire carrier fleet in to do this rescue, because it's a very dangerous aircraft. Sometimes he would. Sometimes he would. But it's an interesting experience when you read through this work on this period, and you find some of the things that are going on and some of the things that have been got up to, and it's particularly interesting. I'm looking for a particular quote, which I have lost a page of. Let me find it. Found it. This was the most serious kamikaze yet we had suffered. Nevertheless, 6 hours later, Formidable had been so far repaired as to be able to gain to operate aircraft. Meanwhile, other Japanese aircraft were attacking the squadron. Amid the bedlam of sound from pom-poms, Oracle guns, and other hangled batteries, I was watching the air battles taking place overhead. Anthony Kimmins, who was aboard Indomitable as a press liaison officer, came up behind me as I was gazing upward and said, "Do you know your flagship has just been hit by a kamikaze?" In fact, I had no idea. The Japanese airman had actually hit our flight deck, but had bounced over the side before his bomb exploded, doing very little structural damage to the ship, but leaving his right hand on deck as proof of his passing. But he had succeeded in damaging our radar. Honestly, for operations, he managed to keep the fleet going. It's got severe supply issues. He's often having to negotiate with Americans of various supplies because, whilst the British are trying to set up a supply base in Sydney and support things from there, there are issues both from the Admiral King end of things and also the sheer distance from Europe. The sheer logistical distance stuff is coming from Britain and for these spare parts. And in fact, it's found that the preparations in Sydney and Australia and other bases which were supposed to be providing some theatre entry bases, like have been planned, Singapore being planned for, haven't been as mature in terms of capability as they'd been hoped to be. The capabilities were there in their raw form, but they weren't at an efficiency which was needed for the scale of operations you were dealing with. There's no rudeness about anyone involved. They're trying their best. But it's like with the air gunners. Vian is really annoyed when he realises his air gunners haven't had adequate training on the carriers. He doesn't feel they've all done their time and they're all going, well, but he's looking at their hours of training, and compared to the training which he put his crews through in the Mediterranean prior to World War II and the destroyer crews and tribal crews, it was a tenth of the hours, pretty much. And there are realities of combat and realities of things going on which are affecting us, and the sheer quantity of facilities available for training. And he starts to rectify that. In fact, one of the problems the Americans occasionally have with the British Pacific Fleet is that they are doing so often, they're doing air defence gunnery training and firing training, that sometimes they're not quite sure if they're under attack or if they're just doing training. And on top of all this, he's got messages coming in from the Admiralty. One message was offering them a duck to replace the towing trucks they have on the ships, on the carriers, to help move around aircraft. And, well, a duck is really too big for it, but he decides they'd rather like an extra boat, so yes, we'd love a duck, because we can use it for an extra boat. And I think he manages to get hold of it. I think it's then used for some very interesting pilot rescue operations. But again, it's one of those areas of history which is incredibly vague. Incredibly vague, finding exact details on this thing. And when the Royal Navy send a long message asking for brevity in communications, this comes from the Admiralty, they then send a report requesting whether or not the steam channels they use on the towards the front of the ship to give them a wind direction should still be involved in the future carriers. And his reply is negat on jets, pretty much. Yeah, I think he says negat on jets. Does he say jet streams or jet? I think it's negat on jets. I should probably look it up, but it's negat on jets. Literally, it's 3 words. And their response to that is, whilst we appreciate your desire for absolute brevity, we need more information than that. Basically, never give Vian a chance. He will find an interesting way to make things more interesting. Honestly, throughout the operations, you see him cajoling, pulling, propelling people forward. He is obsessed with difficulty and maintenance. He loathes the sea fire because of the problems it causes. He knows it's useful in the air, but oh, good lord, does the man find it annoying from the fact it keeps breaking itself. And he has certain issues with some faults of British equipment. He's one of those interesting sources when you read him. When British equipment works, he's very good. I mean, he really likes it. It's wonderful. But when it doesn't work, he will go off and find the people who do it better and will keep telling you that they do it better. There are certain points in this book where you hear about Dutch equipment, where you hear about American equipment, and you'll keep hearing about it in multiple pages about how much it was better than the British equivalent at the time. He's obsessed with getting the best equipment he can get. But war ends. War ends. And when the war ends, what do you do with someone like Vian? Well, you give him various roles, you think about it, various duties. But there's one he really did enjoy, and one where he really got to bring back his full Vian style, even in a peacetime context. And that was the Home Fleet, which he got from January 1950 till June 1952, and he got to command from HMS Vanguard as his flagship. Now you might wonder why he chose to fly his flag in Vanguard, and it was quite simple. He took the policy that his job was to command and coordinate everyone and to be able to support everyone. The carriers needed to be under the command of the carrier commander and needed to be moving with the carrier task forces, and he was going to be in charge of multiple task forces, multiple operations. And he felt Vanguard was the best ship suited for this. It had enough firepower to be of assistance wherever it arrived. If it was slotted into a carrier task force, it would give them decent AA support. If it was slotted into amphibious support, it would give them decent firepower. And if anyone turns up for a surface action, he gets to relive his tribal days. But broadly speaking, he is doing this also because it gives him something he can personally go visiting harbours in. He can personally go on visits to places. And he likes to. He likes to visit areas. He likes to go and do his due diligence and diplomacy and presence. And Vanguard is an excellent tool for this. It really is. And also, in a way, for him, as a man who started his career in gunships and working with guns, it's kind of fitting that he finishes his seagoing career on a gun vessel. On a gun vessel. And it suited him. It really did suit him. By this point, he is Admiral of the Fleet. He's a 5-star equivalent. And he honestly... he knows he's not going to be First Sea Lord. He's not political enough. He's not diplomatic enough. He's got too much baggage in some regards. And he's also making him First Sea Lord means you're making someone who has a temperament of BT First Sea Lord. And that would also put him in direct competition with Mountbatten. And many were worried about that one, because they're worried who would win and how it would fight in another navy. Because they're friends, but whereas one probably wouldn't bear a grudge, the other one certainly would. After this, he goes on to become, he leaves the Navy and he publishes Action This Day in 1960, but he becomes a director of the Midland Bank and director of the North British and Mercantile Insurance Company. He lives till 1968, when he dies, age 73. He's a good officer. And so that being said, let's start talking about a summary. And this is always a scenario I find quite fun because him and Halsey getting together aboard the USS Missouri in mid-1945. I'm fairly sure there are some senior officers who are literally growing hair, going grey and losing their hair, honestly, going at the thought of this pair combining. This is probably a combination which could single-handedly make both Cunningham and King's blood pressure medications need to be raised to the maximum. All in all, though, he is a complicated soul. He's a very good leader. He's a very skilled leader, and he is known for his aggressive actions. But I'm hoping this has taken the view of him being unthinkingly aggressive and turned it on his head. He's a calculating professional. He's capable of great compassion when he wants to be. He's also capable of being very stubborn. He expects incredibly high standards from everyone around him, but especially of himself, but he also gives them the opportunity to learn to become those high standards, to support them in becoming those high standards. He fundamentally believes in the Royal Navy. When he gives his word, and there's that great quote, of course, the carriers will stay as long as we're needed during Salerno. That's him delivering the ethos of the Royal Navy as far as he's concerned. As long as they are needed, he'll be there. With that being said, and with this being the year of leadership, this is a fairly easy question for me to put forward. Which other leaders do you think get a very simplistic reputation but actually are very complicated? Which other leaders? Of World War II, World War I, naval, land, politics or military, and politics, military, whatever. Which other leaders get a very simple reputation but are actually incredibly complicated? Now, what else have we got coming up? Well, next week we have the Battle of Midway. Distance of... Well, yeah. I still can't believe I went with that title. Yes, Distance of Regard. You'll see why. You'll see why when you see it, but it will be an interesting video. It surely will be. And thank you again for liking, sharing, subscribing, supporting this channel, helping it grow. Thank you very much for all the people who are patrons, who do the super chats, super thanks, memberships of the channel, these things. It really does make things possible. Without you, it wouldn't happen. And sorry this has been a long one, but this has been one of the ones I've been looking forward to for a long time, and also it involved quite a bit of reading, but that's because when I realised it, I thought, if I can give you in his own words, that adds something to it. If I can give it to you in his own words, that adds something to it. And that's what I went with. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Take care.